For nearly a century, one private American family controlled the most critical artery of trade between Canada and the United States. They controlled the tolls, they controlled the flow. They controlled the choke point through which a quarter of all bilateral merchandise trade passed. And for decades, Canada tolerated it. That era is ending. When Donald Trump threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, he likely believed he was asserting leverage. Instead, he exposed how much of it had already slipped away. Because the bridge he threatened to stop is not just concrete and steel. It is a $5.7 billion strategic correction. It is redundancy, it is competition, it is insurance. And when it opens, Canada will effectively control the gateway through which nearly 25% of US-Canada automotive trade flows. This is not symbolism, it is structural power. For decades, the Detroit-Windsor corridor has functioned as the single most important commercial gateway in North America. Around 8,000 trucks cross daily. Automotive components move back and forth multiple times before a single vehicle is completed. Engines assembled in Ontario are shipped to Michigan. Transmissions built in Michigan return to Ontario. Steel, electronics, plastics, agricultural goods, finished vehicles. In 2023 alone, more than $50 billion in automotive trade passed through this corridor. Over 150,000 jobs depend directly on its uninterrupted function. And until now, that corridor had a vulnerability so obvious it bordered on reckless. The Ambassador Bridge, opened in 1929, privately owned since 1979 by the Maroon family, controlled the overwhelming majority of heavy commercial traffic. A single 97-year-old bridge, privately operated, profit maximized, with no meaningful competition for decades. Let that sink in. One family collected toll revenue on the busiest trade crossing between the G7 nations. Approximately $60 million per year in toll income. An estimated $1.8 billion family fortune built on controlling a choke point of continental manufacturing. This was not merely infrastructure, it was leverage, and Canada knew it. The vulnerability became undeniable in 2022 when protesters blocked the Ambassador Bridge for 6 days. Ford idled production lines, General Motors reduced shifts. Stellantis warned of plant shutdowns. Assembly facilities dependent on just-in-time logistics began running out of parts within 48 hours. The North American auto supply chain, one of the most integrated industrial systems in the world, nearly fractured because one privately owned bridge was obstructed. For Washington, it was a protest. For auto plants in Ontario and Michigan, it was existential. That was the moment Ottawa's calculation hardened. 25% of bilateral merchandise trade could not depend on a single privately owned choke point beyond Canadian control. Redundancy was no longer optional, it was strategic necessity. So Canada made a decision few nations would make. It would finance an entirely new international bridge on its own. It would absorb the political resistance, it would absorb the lawsuits. It would absorb the $5.7 billion cost. And it would do so not as charity to Michigan, but as insurance for itself. If you are still watching, understand what this means. This is not about a bridge. It is about who controls continental trade arteries in an era of geopolitical volatility. If you value this level of structural analysis, engage now because the implications extend far beyond Detroit. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is not a symbolic crossing. It is a 6-lane, cable-stayed structure directly linking Interstate 75 in Michigan to Highway 401 in Ontario. No city streets, no traffic lights, no urban congestion. Continuous highway-to-highway connectivity. 20 minutes saved per crossing on average. Multiply that across thousands of daily truck movements, and the efficiency gains compound into billions. A University of Windsor study projected to $3 billion in long-term savings over 3 decades from reduced congestion, fuel consumption, and delay volatility alone. But the true value is not speed, it is control. Under the 2012 Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement, Canada financed the entire construction. Michigan contributes no upfront capital. In exchange, Michigan receives 50% ownership at no cost. Canada collects toll revenue initially to recoup its investment. After cost recovery, net toll revenue is split evenly. That agreement was negotiated by Michigan's Republican governor at the time, approved by the Michigan legislature, permitted by the U.S. State Department, authorized by presidential permit, endorsed publicly by Donald Trump in 2017 as a vital economic link. Federal funds were allocated in 2019 for U.S. customs facilities at the bridge. Every legal mechanism is in place. And yet, years later, Trump threatened to block its opening, claiming the United States was not compensated and that the bridge lacked American content. Both claims collapse under public documentation. Michigan already owns half. American steel was used. American workers built the Detroit side. Federal agencies approved the structure. The Department of Homeland Security has already designated it an official port of entry. The threat was not about legality, it was about optics. And optics cannot override treaty-backed infrastructure agreements. But the more revealing dimension is this. Trump's threat demonstrated how little leverage remains over the project. The bridge is 98% complete. Technology systems are undergoing final testing. Interstate connections are finished. Michigan officials, both Republican and Democrat, support its opening. Blocking it would damage Michigan manufacturers first, not Canada. In other words, the threat had no strategic teeth. And that matters because leverage depends on credible enforcement. When enforcement becomes implausible, the leverage dissolves. The Maroon family understood what the Gordie Howe Bridge represented long before it broke ground. When plans for a second crossing emerged in the early 2000s, they spent approximately $30 million attempting to block it. They funded ballot initiatives. They launched legal challenges claiming exclusivity rights. Courts rejected those claims. Michigan voters rejected the obstruction campaign. Lawsuits failed. Why such resistance? Competition. For decades, heavy commercial trucks had no meaningful alternative. Toll rates were effectively dictated by a private operator with monopoly positioning. Once a publicly owned alternative exists, market forces reassert themselves. Trucking companies can choose. Price elasticity returns, monopoly margins compress. The bridge Canada built is not merely redundancy. It is an anti-monopoly instrument, and it shifts bargaining power. When the Gordie Howe Bridge opens, toll competition begins immediately. Logistics companies evaluate cost, time savings, predictability. If public toll rates are lower, traffic shifts. If congestion at the Ambassador Bridge increases, traffic shifts. If protests disrupt one crossing, trade flows through the other. For the first time in nearly half a century, the Detroit-Windsor corridor will operate with competitive infrastructure. That alone reshapes economic gravity, but the deeper story is strategic autonomy. Canada did not build this bridge to punish the United States. It built it to reduce vulnerability to American unpredictability. The same logic driving defense diversification, trade diversification, Arctic infrastructure investment, and alternative supply chain development applies here. Redundancy neutralizes pressure. When a nation depends on a single artery controlled externally, it can be squeezed. When multiple arteries exist under joint or domestic control, leverage declines. Trump's threat inadvertently validated Canada's strategy. By attempting to politicize the opening, he illustrated precisely why redundancy was necessary. If a U.S. president can publicly threaten to obstruct critical trade infrastructure during diplomatic disputes, then dependence on a single crossing is a liability. Canada responded not with retaliation, but with construction. Construction is quieter than confrontation, but it is more permanent. And here is the broader economic implication. The Detroit-Windsor corridor facilitates roughly a quarter of all merchandise trade between the two countries. Automotive supply chains depend on it for continuous throughput. If Canada now controls the financing, toll structure, and operational framework of one of the two primary crossings, its influence over a substantial share of North American auto logistics expands. Not through coercion, through ownership. Ownership changes negotiating posture. For Washington, this is politics. For a factory in Michigan dependent on Ontario engine shipments, it is survival. For a plant in Ontario dependent on Michigan transmissions, it is continuity. And that is why Michigan officials across party lines dismissed the threat as counterproductive. Blocking the bridge would harm American workers first. It would undermine Detroit's auto recovery. It would disrupt a supply chain already vulnerable to semiconductor shortages and geopolitical instability. The bridge is not a favor to Canada, it is a stabilizer for the entire continental auto industry. And yet, politically, it exposes a new reality. Canada is no longer structurally dependent on a single American-controlled choke point for its most critical trade corridor. That psychological shift is enormous. If you believe infrastructure is neutral, reconsider. Infrastructure determines who absorbs shocks and who imposes them. Infrastructure defines which economy halts first during disruption. Infrastructure allocates power quietly beneath headlines. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is a $5.7 billion statement that Canada will not allow 25% of its trade to hinge on a privately owned asset beyond its control. When it opens in early 2026, trucks will flow. Automotive components will move. Toll competition will compress monopoly margins. Redundancy will stabilize supply chains. And the era in which one American family controlled the primary artery of continental manufacturing will officially close. This is not an act of hostility. It is an act of sovereignty, and sovereignty, once reinforced by steel and concrete, is far more durable than rhetoric. But the real shift is not physical, it is strategic. For nearly half a century, the Ambassador Bridge represented more than infrastructure. It represented asymmetry. Canada's most critical trade corridor depended on a privately owned American asset. The toll structure was determined outside Ottawa's influence. The operational continuity of billions in daily trade rested on decisions Canada did not control. That imbalance did not matter when relations were predictable, when trade policy was stable, when cross-border integration was treated as mutually beneficial and insulated from political volatility. But predictability is gone. In recent years, tariffs were imposed and removed with little notice. Trade agreements were renegotiated under pressure. Sovereignty became rhetorical leverage. The 2020 blockade proved that disruption could paralyze manufacturing within days. And when a single protest could idle assembly lines across to nations, it exposed a brutal truth. Efficiency without redundancy is fragility. The North American auto industry operates on just-in-time logistics. Inventory buffers are minimal, parts cross the border multiple times before final assembly. An engine block cast in Windsor might cross into Michigan for machining, return to Ontario for integration, then cross again for installation into a final vehicle. Remove one crossing for even 48 hours and production schedules collapse. This is not theoretical. During the 2020 blockade, losses were measured in the hundreds of millions within a week. Plants slowed, workers were temporarily laid off. Suppliers scrambled to reroute shipments through longer crossings hundreds of miles away. Every additional hour of delay cascaded across a tightly calibrated system. Canada's response was not emotional, it was structural. It financed resilience. By paying the full $5.7 billion construction cost, Ottawa ensured the project would not stall in Michigan's legislature. By offering Michigan 50% ownership at no upfront cost, it removed political resistance. By structuring toll recovery to reimburse Canadian taxpayers over time, it framed the project as investment rather than subsidy. And in doing so, Canada secured operational influence over one of the most economically sensitive corridors in North America. Consider what 25% of bilateral merchandise trade truly represents. This is not a niche flow. It includes finished vehicles, raw materials, agricultural exports, electronics, industrial equipment. If the Detroit-Windsor corridor were a country, its trade volume would rival mid-sized national economies. Control of that corridor does not grant domination, but it grants stability, it grants predictability. It grants leverage in moments of stress, and that leverage now exists on both sides, not just one. When Trump threatened to block the bridge after Canada signed new trade arrangements elsewhere, he revealed something unintended. He revealed that infrastructure is now part of geopolitical signaling, that the opening of a bridge can be framed as concession or retaliation, that logistics arteries are political assets. But here is the critical miscalculation. The Gordie Howe Bridge is not a favor Canada requested from Washington. It is a project Washington already approved, permitted, and partially funded. It is embedded in treaty-backed documentation. It is owned jointly with Michigan. It is designated as an official port of entry. Blocking it would not punish Canada first. It would punish Michigan's auto plants, Detroit's suppliers, and American logistics firms. Which means the threat lacks credible enforcement. And credibility is the currency of leverage. If enforcement risks domestic economic harm greater than foreign pressure gain, the threat collapses under its own weight. Meanwhile, the economic math continues. 20 minutes saved per crossing does not sound revolutionary. But multiply that by 8,000 trucks per day. Multiply that by 365 days per year. Multiply that by fuel consumption, driver hours, depreciation, and supply chain reliability. The cumulative effect approaches billions in efficiency gains over decades. For manufacturers operating on razor-thin margins and tight scheduling windows, predictability is worth more than raw speed. A reliable crossing reduces buffer inventory. Reduced buffer inventory lowers storage costs. Lower storage costs increase capital efficiency. In macroeconomic terms, infrastructure efficiency compounds. And compounding reshapes competitiveness. Detroit's recovery as an automotive hub depends on stable integration with Ontario's parts ecosystem. Ontario's employment base depends on Michigan's assembly plants. The corridor is not a zero-sum artery, it is a symbiotic one, which is precisely why monopoly control was always an anomaly. A privately owned choke point in the middle of a continental supply chain was a relic of another era. An era when cross-border trade was smaller, when manufacturing cycles were slower, when geopolitical friction was lower. That era ended long ago. The infrastructure lagged behind. The Gordie Howe Bridge closes that gap. When it opens, trucking companies will evaluate cost structures immediately. If tolls at the public crossing undercut private rates, volume shifts. If congestion patterns favor one crossing over the other, algorithms will reroute fleets in real time. Logistics optimization software will treat both bridges as interchangeable nodes, choosing dynamically based on efficiency. Competition will discipline pricing. And that alone alters power dynamics that persisted for decades, but the shift goes further. Infrastructure ownership influences long-term industrial planning. When Canada controls financing and operational frameworks for one of two primary crossings, it can align toll policies with strategic economic goals. It can coordinate infrastructure upgrades with trade policy objectives. It can ensure capacity expansion keeps pace with projected export growth, not aggressively, not coercively, strategically. The same philosophy guiding Canada's diversification of defense procurement and trade partnerships appears here. Reduce single-point vulnerability. Reduce exposure to unilateral pressure. Expand optionality. Optionality is power. When a country has alternatives, it negotiates differently. It absorbs shocks differently. It evaluates diplomatic friction differently. This is why the bridge matters beyond Detroit. It represents a broader shift toward strategic redundancy in an era where unpredictability has become normalized. Canada is not disengaging from the United States, it is insulating itself from volatility, and insulation reduces leverage. For American policymakers accustomed to asymmetry, that reduction can feel like loss. But it is not hostility, it is adaptation. Consider the optics carefully. Canada financed the project. Canada carried the construction risk. Canada navigated the legal battles. Canada absorbed nearly $6 billion in upfront cost. And Michigan receives half ownership without capital contribution, plus long-term revenue share once costs are recovered. From a purely transactional perspective, the arrangement favors Michigan significantly, which makes the threat to block it even more paradoxical. If enforcement harms your own industrial base, your leverage evaporates. And that is the larger lesson here. Trade corridors are not just economic conveniences. They are geopolitical stabilizers. When stabilized, they reduce the effectiveness of coercive tactics. When diversified, they blunt the impact of political volatility. The Gordie Howe Bridge is not anti-American, it is anti-fragility. And fragility is the true enemy of integrated economies. When it opens, headlines will focus on ribbon cuttings and cable spans. But beneath that symbolism lies a structural recalibration of power within North American trade. For nearly a century, one bridge dominated, one ownership structure dictated terms. One artery carried disproportionate weight. Soon, there will be two, and that difference is enough to alter behavior, pricing, negotiation, and resilience for decades. This is not dramatic realignment through confrontation. It is quiet realignment through construction. And construction lasts longer than rhetoric. The deeper story is not about Trump. It is not even about the Maroon family. It is about what happens when infrastructure becomes geopolitical insurance. For decades, the assumption inside Washington was simple. Canada needed access to American markets more than America needed Canadian access points. The imbalance in population, GDP, and military power reinforced that perception. Canada was the smaller partner, the dependent partner, the predictable partner. But dependency erodes when alternatives are built. The Detroit-Windsor corridor processes nearly 1/4 of all merchandise trade between the two countries. In the automotive sector alone, the integration is so tight that a finished vehicle can cross the border half a dozen times before reaching a dealership. North America does not have to separate auto industries. It has one integrated system, and that system runs on frictionless crossings. When friction increases, assembly lines shut down within days. This is not rhetoric, it is mechanical reality. Plants are calibrated to the hour, suppliers deliver on precise windows. Warehousing is minimized to reduce carrying costs. Interrupt the crossing and the shockwaves spread instantly. In that context, controlling even one of the two primary bridges in the corridor is not about symbolism. It is about operational continuity. Before Gordie Howe, heavy commercial traffic had effectively one dominant option. Yes, the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel exists, but it is limited in heavy freight capacity. For manufacturing scale logistics, the Ambassador Bridge was the artery. That created a single point of failure, and single points of failure are unacceptable in modern supply chains. When Canada financed Gordie Howe, it did something few countries are willing to do. It spent billions not to expand trade, but to stabilize it. Not to grow leverage, but to neutralize vulnerability, and that distinction matters. If this analysis is resonating, understand that you are looking at infrastructure through a geopolitical lens most media never applies. This is not about partisan politics, it is about structural power distribution inside continental trade. When the bridge opens, toll revenue initially flows to Canada until the $5.7 billion construction cost is recovered. That may take years, but the long horizon is not the point. The point is that Canada now sits at the financial center of one of North America's most vital commercial arteries. After cost recovery, Michigan receives 50% of net toll revenue indefinitely. That creates alignment. Michigan benefits from volume. Canada benefits from resilience, both benefit from redundancy. And the private monopoly era ends. For 47 years, the Ambassador Bridge generated monopoly margins. Without competition, toll elasticity was limited. Carriers absorbed costs because alternatives were weak. That era fostered profit concentration at the choke point. Competition dismantles that concentration, and monopoly dismantlement redistributes economic benefit across the supply chain. Lower tolls reduce shipping costs. Reduced shipping costs lower input prices. Lower input prices enhance competitiveness. The gains diffuse outward. Which is precisely why the Maroon family fought the project so aggressively for 2 decades. Legal challenges, ballot initiatives, lobbying campaigns. Public messaging that framed the bridge as unnecessary. But unnecessary for whom? For a monopoly. Competition is unnecessary. For a continent dependent on resilient logistics, it is essential. Trump's intervention arrived at the final stage of construction. The bridge is structurally complete. Highway connections are integrated. Customs facilities are operationally prepared. The Department of Homeland Security has formalized its port of entry status. There is no practical mechanism left to reverse it without triggering legal confrontation, treaty violations, and economic backlash within Michigan itself. And that reveals the final layer of miscalculation. Political threats are effective only when the target lacks structural alternatives. Canada no longer lacks them. The bridge is part of a broader pattern. Diversification of trade partners, expansion of Arctic port capacity, alternative rail corridors bypassing traditional American transit routes, investment in domestic supply chain resilience, defense procurement diversification with European partners. Each project reduces exposure incrementally. Individually, these moves appear technical. Collectively, they represent strategic recalibration. Canada is not disengaging from the United States. It remains deeply integrated. But it is no longer willing to operate with single-point dependencies that can be politicized. When Trump threatened to block the bridge in response to unrelated trade developments, he inadvertently confirmed Ottawa's logic. If infrastructure can be rhetorically weaponized, then infrastructure must be insulated. The Gordie Howe Bridge is insulation. It does not give Canada dominance over U.S. auto trade, but it gives Canada influence over a corridor that carries roughly 25% of it. Influence is not control, but influence matters during disruption. If one crossing experiences technical failure, traffic shifts. If toll disputes emerge at one, carriers migrate to the other. If protests target one, redundancy absorbs shock. This is how resilient systems behave. For Washington, the optics may feel uncomfortable. Canada financed and now co-owns critical cross-border infrastructure at scale, but the economic logic is mutual. Michigan's auto industry depends on Ontario suppliers just as much as Ontario depends on Michigan assembly. In fact, blocking the bridge would likely damage American manufacturing first. Michigan's economy is tightly bound to Canadian inputs. Governors, senators, and business leaders across party lines understand this. That is why opposition to the threat was bipartisan. Because when supply chains fracture, ideology is irrelevant. Production halts. The true takeaway is not about who wins politically. It is about how modern states adapt to volatility. Canada looked at a 97-year-old privately owned choke point carrying a quarter of its trade and asked a simple question: what happens if this fails? The answer in 2022 was devastating enough to justify $5.7 billion in prevention. Prevention is rarely celebrated, it lacks drama, but it is transformative. When the Gordie Howe International Bridge opens, trucks will not cross differently. Engines will not look different. Drivers will not feel a geopolitical shift. But beneath the routine, a strategic vulnerability will have been neutralized. The monopoly will be broken. The redundancy will be operational. The leverage once embedded in private ownership will be diluted by competition. And Canada will have demonstrated something fundamental. When confronted with unpredictability, it does not escalate rhetorically. It builds steel, concrete, highways, redundancy, because infrastructure is policy cast in physical form. And once poured, it does not yield to tweets. The opening of this bridge will not dominate headlines for long. The outrage cycle will move on. But for the North American auto industry, for supply chain planners, for logistics executives calculating risk exposure, the shift will be permanent. One choke point becomes to arteries, one monopoly becomes a competitive corridor. One vulnerability becomes a controlled redundancy. And that is how quiet strategic independence is built, not by confrontation, but by construction that outlasts it.